The first thing Dr. Sterling noticed was her hand shaking. Not violently. Not the tremor of fear or fatigue. The kind of tremor that comes from holding something back. From gripping something that wants to explode outward. Megan O'Brien stood in Trauma Bay 2 at Oak Creek Memorial, a hospital that rose from Portland's rain-soaked streets like a monument to ordered suffering, and her fingers quivered as she reached for the crash cart. Her scrubs hung loose on a frame that moved with the kind of unconscious precision that comes from carrying weight nobody else could see. Dr. Sterling watched from the doorway, his tailored coat catching the fluorescent light, and made a mental note. Weakness. Exploitable weakness. The patient on the gurney had arrived 8 minutes earlier. 42-year-old male. Stab wound to the right anterior thorax. The kind of trauma that separates the competent from the catastrophic. The ER staff moved with the choreography of experience, surgical techs calling out vitals, nurses drawing labs, the attending already barking orders that nobody questioned. And then Megan had hesitated. 1 second. Maybe 2. Long enough for Sterling to notice. Long enough for that hesitation to sit like a bird on a wire, waiting to be studied. BP dropping. The resident's voice cracked slightly. 90/60 and falling. Oxygen saturation? 88, and climbing down. A tech adjusted the ventilator. The mechanical wheeze of the unit filled the bay like the breathing of something alive. Monitors beeped their urgent rhythm, 150, 148, 145, the heart rate spiking as the body understood what was coming. Hemorrhagic shock. Blood loss. The kind of physics that doesn't negotiate. Sounds like a tension pneumothorax, someone said. Or cardiac tamponade. Megan's jaw clenched. Sterling saw it. Her eyes tightened at the corners, and her hands gripped the steel edge of the gurney until her knuckles went white. For just an instant, her shoulders squared. As if muscle memory had tried to wake her. As if something older than this hospital was trying to surface. Then she released the breath she'd been holding and stepped back. Let the surgical resident take the lead. Deferred authority when the moment demanded command. A nurse who knew her place. Who stayed in it? Sterling smiled. The resident called for a needle decompression. Megan retrieved the 14-gauge angiocath from the crash cart with precise efficiency, her movements economical and rehearsed, the kind of preparation that suggested familiarity with trauma. But she didn't lead. Didn't suggest. Didn't command. She handed over the needle and watched the resident place it at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The hiss of air escaping from the collapsed lung. The sound of pressure releasing. Of systems balancing back toward equilibrium. Pressures coming back up, the tech called. 92/65. 94/96. 02 sat climbing, another voice. 89/91. 93. The rhythm stabilized. The patient's color returned from the shade of ash to something approaching human. The breathing eased. The monitors settled into a pattern that suggested survival was still negotiable. The entire code had taken less than 6 minutes. The kind of elegant crisis intervention that separates genuine competence from the performance of competence. The kind of work that should have earned recognition. The surgical team began discussing admission. ICU versus step-down care. Thoracic surgery involvement. The trauma surgeon glanced at Megan as she began restocking the crash cart with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Good catch calling the tamponade, he said. Most nurses would have let that become a full arrest. Sterling watched her shoulders tighten. Watched her nod once without meeting his eyes. Watched her return to her tasks as though the compliment had been directed at someone else entirely. And in that moment, Dr. Sterling made a decision that would reshape the trajectory of both their lives. He would watch her more carefully. This nurse with the military posture and the careful deference and the hesitation that suggested she was hiding something. She could be useful. Or she could be a problem. He simply needed to determine which. He turned and walked back into the hallway, the antiseptic smell of the hospital coating his throat like the taste of authority. Sterling had built his entire career on the principle that hierarchy was not negotiable. He was chief physician of the emergency department at Oak Creek Memorial. His word was law. His decisions were not questioned by nurses or residents or even the hospital administrator. His office occupied the third floor, overlooking the city, with a view of Mount Hood in the distance on clear days. He'd cultivated relationships with the hospital board, with insurance companies, with politicians who understood that Sterling was a man who got results. A 98.2% trauma survival rate. 0 malpractice settlements. Staff retention that was the envy of the Pacific Northwest. All of it built on absolute control. And control required subordination. Required nurses who understood their lane. Who didn't carry themselves like they'd spent time in spaces where hesitation meant death. Who didn't have the kind of scarred forearms that told stories Sterling had learned to recognize in his surgical rotation. Who didn't touch worn combat boots at the beginning of their shift like the boots might disappear if they weren't acknowledged. He'd seen her do that an hour earlier. In the break room. Locker 42. She'd opened it, looked inside for exactly 7 seconds, her expression shifting into something private and ancient. Then closed it. Moved on. The kind of ritual that suggested the boots were MacGuffin, something being kept safe because it carried meaning beyond leather and stitching. Maybe from a deployment. Maybe from someone. Maybe something that could become leverage if the situation required leverage. By 11:19 p.m., the ER had settled into the kind of controlled chaos that characterizes late-shift hospital work. 2 minor injuries. 1 psychiatric hold. A middle-aged man convinced his chest pain was cardiac when his EKG was clean and his troponin level was normal. The machines hummed their constant surveillance. The fluorescent lights buzzed like insects trapped in plastic. And Megan O'Brien sat in the break room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, her phone dark on the table beside her. Sterling passed the doorway and noticed her checking the screen. Once. Twice. Then setting it back down without responding to whatever message waited there. A son, perhaps. A family member. Someone from the life she'd constructed outside these walls. She took a breath and drank the cold coffee without flinching, her expression settling into something that looked like acceptance. Like someone who'd learned to live with silence as a constant companion. She didn't notice Sterling watching from the hallway. Didn't see his assessment of her as he calculated angles and vulnerabilities. Didn't know that her hesitation during the trauma code had awakened something in him, the hunter's instinct that comes when you identify prey that might be worth hunting. She simply sat there, this middle-aged nurse with trembling hands and military posture and a pair of worn combat boots hidden in her locker, and waited for her shift to end. But that wasn't the worst part. What neither of them understood in that moment was that Megan O'Brien wasn't weak. The trembling in her hands wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the tremor of someone holding back a hurricane with conscious effort. It was the physical manifestation of a woman who'd spent 11 years teaching her nervous system to obey commands her mind no longer issued. And Dr. Sterling, in his certainty about what he'd observed, had made the fundamental error of every predator who'd ever hunted a warrior in hiding. He'd mistaken the mask for the face beneath it. The night shift continued. Alarms beeped their mechanical chorus. The ER doors opened and closed with the rhythm of crisis and resolution. Rain hammered the parking lot outside like something demanding entrance. And Megan O'Brien finished her shift at 7 a.m., clocked out, and drove through Portland's wet streets toward a small house near the river where a life waited that nobody could have understood. 3 hours later, she would return to Oak Creek Memorial. For hours after that, everything Sterling believed about her would be proven wrong. But for now, in this moment before the avalanche, she was just a nurse finishing her shift. Just a woman with a secret. Just someone trying to stay hidden in plain sight. Sterling had no idea who he'd just decided to destroy. Morning rounds at Oak Creek Memorial moved like a tide of white coats and stethoscopes, the kind of institutional choreography where hierarchy flowed downward and everyone understood their place in it. Dr. Sterling stood at the center of the trauma bay, surrounded by 15 staff members, residents, nurses, physician's assistants, respiratory therapists, gathered like disciples at an altar. His voice carried the particular timbre of a man accustomed to unquestioned authority, smooth as aged whiskey and twice as intoxicating to those who craved proximity to his power. "I'm making a public wager," he announced, his eyes finding Megan where she stood near the supply station, her clipboard held like a shield against her chest. "Our newest addition, the timid Miss O'Brien here, won't last a week in my department. Any takers?" His smile was a knife wrapped in silk. "I'll give 2-to-1 odds. She'll run back to whatever small-town facility was desperate enough to hire her the moment things get challenging." Laughter rippled through the assembled staff like wind through shallow water. Some of it was nervous, the sound of people who understood they were witnessing a calculated public diminishment but lacked the standing to refuse participation. Others laughed with genuine amusement, the easy cruelty of those who'd never questioned their place at the top. Megan's jaw tightened. Just a fraction. A movement so small that only someone trained to read minute muscular responses would notice. She took one measured breath, the kind that came from muscle memory deeper than conscious thought, the kind learned in situations where panic meant death, where control was the only weapon that fit in a closed space. One tear escaped. Just one. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Sterling, her fingers moving with deliberate slowness across her cheekbone as 50 pairs of eyes watched. The gesture said everything her voice didn't need to say. "I've survived worse men than you, Doctor." Her words emerged quietly, each syllable weighted like a stone dropped into still water. "Much worse." The room went dead silent. The kind of silence where you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the distant electronic beeping of monitors in trauma bays, the whisper of air through the ventilation system. Sterling's smile didn't fade, but something flickered behind his eyes, a momentary recognition that his calculated humiliation had landed in unexpected terrain. He recovered quickly, turning away with a dismissive wave. "We'll see." But his shoulders had stiffened. The ease had drained from his movements. Megan had violated the script he'd written for her, which meant he would need to revise his approach. The next day, the cafeteria at Oak Creek Memorial was a symphony of institutional noise, the clatter of trays, the hum of fluorescent panels, the background murmur of conversations compressed into a rectangular space that smelled of overcooked vegetables and industrial cleaning solution. Megan sat alone at a small table near the eastern windows, a cup of coffee and a sandwich in front of her, her eyes fixed on the middle distance in that way people develop when they want to discourage conversation. Sterling emerged from the service line carrying a tray. His trajectory through the cafeteria was precise, calculated, the kind of movement that appeared casual until the moment he passed her table and his elbow connected with the corner of her tray. The contact was decisive, impossible to mistake for accident, though in the seconds afterward Sterling's expression shifted into exaggerated surprise. The tray clattered to the floor. Soup erupted across tile in a spreading stain the color of rust. Silverware scattered like shrapnel. The ceramic plate shattered into 3 large fragments and a dozen smaller pieces, each one reflecting the overhead lights as they skidded across the cafeteria floor. Conversation stopped as though someone had cut the audio feed. 50 staff members turned to watch. Sterling stood over Megan, his hands arranged in a posture of apology that his face didn't mirror. "Oh, how clumsy. Pick that up, sweetheart." His voice dripped with manufactured concern, the kind used by predators who understood that charm was a more effective weapon than aggression. Megan rose slowly. Her movements were unhurried, methodical, the physical equivalent of refusing to be rushed. She knelt on the cafeteria floor, her scrubs pressing against tile still wet from the soup, and began gathering broken ceramic with her bare hands. One piece. Then another. She moved like a woman performing a sacred ritual, each fragment handled with a care that seemed to dignify it. Sterling watched from above, his jaw working with satisfaction. This was the correct response. This was the arc he'd predicted, humiliation leading to surrender, leading to resignation. By the end of the week, Miss O'Brien would tender her letter and his emergency department would return to its proper order. On the third day, during afternoon rounds with the patient sensors hanging at critical levels and 3 beds containing post-operative complications, Sterling threw her chart at her feet in front of the patient's family. The manila folder exploded against linoleum, papers cascading across the floor like wounded birds. "Your documentation is inadequate, sweetheart. Redo all of it. On your knees if you have to." His words were pitched to Carrie, to ensure that the family heard the disrespect, to create maximum witness to her degradation. Megan knelt in front of the family without comment. She gathered each page with the same deliberate care she'd demonstrated in the cafeteria, her hand steady despite the humiliation radiating from every corner of the room. The patient's daughter watched with obvious discomfort. The patient himself, a 53-year-old man recovering from emergency cardiac surgery, met Megan's eyes as she collected his chart, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, perhaps. The kind that comes from understanding that you are watching a person absorb a deliberate wound and remain intact. Sterling began calling her sweetheart exclusively after that, weaponizing the diminutive until it metastasized through the department. Other nurses adopted it unconsciously, their tone slightly different than Sterling's but still carrying the subtle message that she was something less than a peer. A term of endearment that functioned as a cage. But Megan never responded with anger. She never responded at all. She simply continued her work with a precision that was impossible to fault, her movements economical and practiced, the kind of efficiency that came from knowing that every gesture should matter. She took one measured breath whenever the humiliation peaked, and somehow that silence was more powerful than any outburst could have been. Sterling found himself increasingly frustrated. Public ridicule was supposed to shatter confidence. It was supposed to produce the tears and the retreat and the resignation letter. Instead, it seemed to produce something else entirely, a kind of containment that he couldn't penetrate, a calm that his cruelty couldn't crack. That evening, the trauma alert came through like a gunshot through the hospital's radio system. Major trauma inbound. Multiple gunshot wounds. ETA for minutes. The resuscitation bay erupted into controlled chaos. Gurneys were positioned. Equipment was verified. Blood products were staged. The team moved with the synchronized precision of people who'd trained together through the kind of scenarios that separated competent emergency departments from exceptional ones. The ambulance doors burst open and the stretcher emerged, the paramedics moving in perfect synchronization, one on each side, one at the head managing the airway, one calling out vital signs to the trauma nurse who was running parallel with them. Male, 34, gunshot wound left anterior chest, one entrance wound, no visible exit. Vitals on scene were 91, systolic dropping to 86, heart rate 142, respiratory rate 28, oxygen saturation 92% on non-rebreather. The paramedics' words came in rapid succession, each one a data point painting a picture of catastrophic injury. The stretcher collided with the resuscitation bed. The transfer happened in seconds, 1, 2, 3, lift. The patient was suddenly under the hospital's lights, his chest exposed, his injury visible as a single dark aperture in the left anterior chest wall approximately 4 centimeters lateral to the midclavicular line. Megan's eyes found the intake chart before her consciousness fully registered what her vision was reporting. Captain James O'Brien. 3rd Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment. Her son's commanding officer. The man who'd attended her husband Tom's funeral 17 months ago with his own uniform pressed to knife-edge perfection and his eyes carrying the particular weight of someone who'd attended too many funerals. The man who'd pressed her hand in both of his at the graveside and said, "Tom was the finest operator I ever served with. I'll watch over your son for you. I give you my word." Her hands began trembling. Not with fear. With the sudden recognition that she'd just exposed herself, that the compartmentalizing she'd maintained through 4 days of public humiliation was about to collapse under the weight of someone she was obligated to save. "Get a level 1 up," Sterling commanded, moving to the patient's side. "Chest tube setup, stat. We need." "Cardiac tamponade," Megan said quietly, stepping forward. Her tremor vanished the moment her hands touched the equipment, muscle memory erasing emotion with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "Pericardiocentesis. Now." Sterling's head snapped toward her. You're a nurse, sweetheart. The fluid in his pericardium is compressing his heart. He'll arrest in 90 seconds if we don't relieve the pressure. Her voice had shifted. The deference had evaporated. Something else had taken its place, a voice like a tank idling in a garage, powerful and controlled and absolutely certain of its own authority. Ultrasound. 2 milliliter syringe. 18-gauge needle. The residents looked to Sterling. Sterling looked at Megan with an expression that suggested he was calculating how much authority he could challenge before it became insubordination. He decided against it, turning back to the monitor. Megan's hands moved through the procedure with the fluid precision of someone who'd performed it dozens of times. The needle penetrated the pericardial membrane. The syringe withdrew dark fluid, blood accumulated around the heart, squeezing it, suffocating it. 20 milliliters. 40. 60. The monitor changed. The vital signs that had been plummeting suddenly stabilized. 104 systolic. Heart rate 132. The compressed chambers expanded. Captain O'Brien's eyes opened. His hand moved, fingers grasping at the oxygen tubing. Alive! Sterling's jaw clenched with such force that Megan could see the muscle working beneath his skin. He turned and left the resuscitation bay without speaking, his departure carrying the particular energy of someone whose carefully constructed certainty had just been demolished. 3 hours later, Megan stood outside the trauma ICU watching Captain O'Brien's monitors trace their steady rhythm. His vitals were holding. The surgical team was preparing him for emergency thoracotomy. He would probably survive. She pulled her locker open. The worn combat boot sat on the bottom shelf, Tom's final mission embedded in every scuff mark and worn lace. She touched the leather with one trembling finger and whispered into the empty break room, "I had to save him. I'm sorry." That night, Sterling was waiting in the hallway outside the ICU when Megan emerged. His voice was low and venomous, the kind used by predators who'd been cornered and were beginning to recognize that they might need to escalate beyond humiliation. "I'm going to find out everything about you, sweetheart. Every gap in your employment history. Every reason you're hiding in my ER playing small-town nurse. I'm going to pull your personnel file apart thread by thread." His smile was terrifying in its certainty. "And when I find what you're running from, and I will find it, this hospital will never want you again." But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what made her chest tighten as she walked through the parking lot into the Portland rain. The worst part was that Sterling was right. There were gaps. There were reasons. There was something she'd spent 18 months burying, something that would unravel the moment anyone with institutional power decided to pull at the threads. And now, standing in the cold rain with water soaking through her scrubs, Megan understood something with the clarity that comes only from having survived worse. She'd just transformed from a woman in hiding into a woman who'd exposed her operational capability in front of the man most determined to destroy her. The overhead speaker crackled at 11:13 p.m., a sound like static tearing through silk. "Trauma alert! Trauma alert! Gunshot wound, chest cavity. ETA 3 minutes." Megan's head lifted from the medication cart. 3 minutes. The number landed like a stone in still water. The ER exploded into motion. Trauma Bay 3 doors swung open. Nurses began arranging instruments with the practiced choreography of people who'd done this 1,000 times. The smell of antiseptic intensified as someone sprayed down the treatment table. Megan moved toward the bay without thinking, her body already knowing the rhythm, her hands already steady. The ambulance doors burst open like a concussive percussion. They wheeled in a man on a blood-soaked gurney, his chest wrapped in field dressing, his breathing shallow and urgent. The paramedic was calling vitals in that clipped, urgent voice, BP 89/56 and dropping. O2 sat 78%. 1 GSW, right anterior chest, massive hemorrhage. We've got 2 large borefors running wide open. ETA to your facility was 14 minutes. He's been crashing for the last 4. The trauma surgeon's voice cut through, into Bay 3. "Move, people. Respiratory, Prepare for intubation. Cardiothoracic, I need you standing by. Megan stepped forward to catch the chart from the paramedic's hands, and her eyes found the name before she meant to look for it. Captain James O'Brien. The world didn't tilt. It simply stopped rotating for exactly 3 seconds. Her hands didn't shake. They didn't betray her. But something in her chest fractured like glass beneath a hammer strike, not audibly, not visibly, but with a force that made breathing an act of deliberate control. Captain James O'Brien. Her son's commanding officer. The man who'd sent her a package 18 months ago containing a pair of worn combat boots with dust from the streets of Baghdad still embedded in the creases, accompanied by a handwritten note. Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien, your husband would be proud of what your son is becoming. These belong to him. They belong with you. She'd never opened the package in her son's presence. She couldn't. Vitals? Dr. Sterling's voice cut through the moment. He was there, materializing like smoke in the corner of the trauma bay, his white coat pristine, his expression already calculating. Already hunting. BP dropping. Heart rate 142 and climbing, someone called. He's going into shock. Get him on the monitor. 2 units O negative, stat. I want a chest X-ray and a fast ultrasound immediately. Sterling moved toward the patient, but his eyes found Megan for just a fraction of a second, a look like a predator recognizing fresh meat in the water. Megan attached the cardiac monitor. The rhythm appeared on the screen, sinus tachycardia, climbing. The patient's breathing was labored, asymmetrical. One side of his chest wasn't rising properly. The gunshot wound had collapsed his lung. But there was something else in the sound, a muffled quality, a dampness that didn't belong. Listen to his lungs, Megan said quietly. She was moving now, her military training overriding everything else, muscle memory taking control of hands and voice. Decreased breath sounds on the right. Unequal chest expansion. Sterling glanced at her with an expression that suggested she'd spoken out of turn. I'm aware, nurse. Get me the X-ray. But Megan was already moving to the bedside, her stethoscope already in position. The problem wasn't just the collapsed lung. The quality of the breath sounds was wrong. The percussion was wrong. There was fluid where there shouldn't be fluid. Not blood from the wound itself, this was something else. This was the sound of a heart drowning in its own pericardial sac. Beck's triad, she said, and this time it wasn't a suggestion. Her voice had dropped an octave, the careful deference stripped away. Muffled heart sounds. Jugular venous distension. Hypertension. He's got a pericardial effusion. Tension physiology. We need to decompress now or he goes into cardiac arrest in the next. She glanced at the monitor, at the climbing heart rate, at the plummeting blood pressure. 90 seconds. Sterling stepped forward, his jaw tightening. That's not your call to make, nurse. We need imaging first. We follow protocol. The monitor's alarm shrieked. A single sustained tone. Ventricular fibrillation. The patient's chest seized. His body went rigid. His heart had stopped coordinating its electrical rhythm. In the next 3 minutes, without intervention, he would be dead. Megan was already moving. She was reaching for the 18-gauge needle, already calculating the anatomical landmarks, the fourth intercostal space, the left midclavicular line, the path through the skin and the pericardium. This was the procedure that had gotten her noticed by Sterling in the first place, the unauthorized pericardiocentesis that saved a life and challenged his authority. Stand back, Sterling said. It wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It was the voice of institutional power, of a man who'd spent 15 years building a network of allies and leverage points. I'm calling cardiothoracic for an emergency thoracotomy. We do this in the OR under proper conditions. There is no OR time, Megan said. Her hand was steady as she prepped the site with betadine. He doesn't have 5 minutes. He has 90 seconds of perfusion left before his brain dead. You're overstepping your scope of practice, and you're going to cause this patient more harm. The monitor alarm continued its scream. 11:49 p.m. 2 minutes since the patient arrived. The clock was eating seconds. Megan inserted the needle. She felt the distinctive pop as it pierced the pericardial membrane. The aspiration syringe attached to the needle filled immediately with dark blood. 20 milliliters. 30. 40. The blood that had been compressing the heart's chambers, strangling it, drowning it. The monitor changed. 1 beat. 2. The rhythm came back. Chaotic at first, then organizing itself into something that resembled order. The patient's oxygen saturation began climbing. 82%. 85%. His blood pressure ticked upward, 68. 72, 78. He was alive. Get me 2 units. Get me a chest tube kit. Someone call CT and let them know we're coming up for imaging in 5, the trauma surgeon said. She was already moving past Sterling toward the patient, already taking command. Already recognizing what needed to happen next. Sterling stood at the edge of the trauma bay, his expression a mask of clinical detachment that didn't quite hide the fact that something crucial had shifted in the room's hierarchy. That night, while Captain O'Brien was sleeping peacefully in the ICU with 2 full lines, 2 units of blood, and his heart beating steadily inside a chest that should have been dead, Sterling walked into the hospital administrator's office. It was 1:17 a.m. The office was dark except for a desk lamp, but Sterling turned on the overhead fluorescence with the casual authority of someone who'd done this before. He sat at the computer and began typing. Policy Violation Report. Number 1. Submitted by Dr. Lawrence Sterling, Chief Physician, Emergency Department. Incident date, today's date. Time, 23:49. Staff member, Megan O'Brien, RN. Violation, unauthorized emergency medical procedure. Staff member performed emergency pericardiocentesis without physician authorization, direct order, or consultation. This constitutes scope of practice violation per hospital policy section 4.2.1. Patient outcome was positive, but procedure was executed without proper administrative oversight, creating liability for the institution. Recommend immediate review and disciplinary action. He filed it electronically. Watched it vanish into the hospital system. Then he opened a new document. Policy Violation Report. Number 2. Incident date, today's date. Time, 23:49. Violation, insubordination and disregard of direct physician order. Staff member directly contradicted physician directive during active trauma code. Staff member made independent clinical judgment that superseded physician authority. This undermines the chain of command and creates dangerous precedent for nursing staff believing they can override physician decisions. Recommend immediate corrective action. Filed. Policy Violation Report. Number 3. Violation, emotional instability during critical patient care. Sterling paused on this one. He needed to be careful. Emotional instability was a landmine if not worded correctly. But there was something in this woman's personnel file, something incomplete. Gaps. Unexplained gaps. He picked up his phone. It was 1:34 a.m. He knew board members who wouldn't mind being woken. Men who owed him. Men whose daughters had gotten into expensive private schools through Sterling's connections. Men whose business deals had gone smoothly because Sterling had helped facilitate introductions. The first call went to David Bancroft, hospital board treasurer. A man who'd been grateful when Sterling had helped his son avoid a DUI by suggesting the right lawyer. David, I'm sorry for the hour. We have a staffing issue I need to discuss at the board level. Yes, it's urgent. There's a nurse in the ER, her name's Megan O'Brien, and I'm concerned about her fitness for duty. Her employment history is spotty. Very spotty. Short-term positions, gaps that don't add up. I had an incident tonight where she overrode my clinical judgment on a trauma patient. Insubordination in a high-stress environment. I'm wondering if you could recommend we initiate a full background review before she causes real harm. I'm filing formal reports, but I wanted you to know I'm concerned she may have undisclosed mental health issues. PTSD, possibly. The way she responded to that patient tonight, the intensity, the certainty that only comes from people who've seen things. I don't hire people like that. Too unpredictable. He hung up. Waited 40 seconds. Called the next board member. Then the next. By 2:44 a.m., Sterling had activated a network of 8 board members and 2 investigators who would be arriving at Oak Creek Memorial by Thursday with questions about Megan O'Brien's past, her employment history, and her current stability. He'd learned something crucial from tonight: this woman wasn't just competent. She was dangerous. She'd saved that patient through sheer clinical instinct and willingness to override authority. In a hospital where Sterling's power came from the respect he commanded through institutional position, that was a threat more serious than any complaint. Better to plant seeds now. Better to make sure her past caught up with her before anyone realized what she was truly capable of. In the ICU, Megan stood beside Captain O'Brien's bedside at 3:22 a.m. The monitors glowed steady. His heart rhythm was organized. His oxygen saturation holding at 96%. His blood pressure stable. She read his chart one more time, letting the details sink in. 3 tours in the Middle East. Service record spotless. 2 commendations. Deployed alongside her own units in 2009, 2011, and 2013. The dates matched. The locations matched. This man had served in Baghdad during her final tour, during the deployment where everything had changed, where she'd learned that some things couldn't be unseen. The chart also contained something else, a note from the patient's emergency contact. Next of kin, Lieutenant Commander Daniel O'Brien, active duty, Naval Air Station Whidbey Island. Her son, Captain James O'Brien, had come to Oak Creek Memorial in Portland by coincidence or something deeper, come through the doors with a gunshot wound, and she'd saved his life, and now Sterling was circling, already making calls, already building the case to destroy her before anyone found out who she really was. She pressed a hand against the side of his chest, felt the heartbeat steady and strong beneath her palm. "I won't let them hurt you," she whispered. But she was already wondering if she could keep that promise. The ICU doors burst open at 11:56 p.m. 2 men in tactical gear, faces covered, weapons holstered but accessible. They moved like operators, trained, efficient, the kind of men who knew exactly what they wanted and wouldn't ask twice. The taller one, team lead by his bearing, stepped straight to Captain O'Brien's bed without hesitation. "Transfer the patient. Now. He comes with us." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in the flat tone of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. The night shift nurse at the monitor station froze, hand hovering over her keyboard. Alarms continued their steady beeping, Captain O'Brien's vitals holding stable, O2 sat at 94%, heart rate steady at 72. Good numbers. Real numbers. Numbers that meant he was recovering. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway within seconds, drawn by the commotion like a predator sensing weakness. Megan watched his face shift, surprise giving way to calculation, then something darker. His eyes flicked from the armed intruders to the patient to Megan, and she saw the exact moment he made his decision. He moved toward Captain O'Brien's bed, toward compliance, toward handing over the patient to men he'd never verified, men whose authority he hadn't questioned. His hand reached for the 4-line disconnection protocol. Megan's body moved before her mind caught up. She stepped between the armed men and Captain O'Brien's bed, positioning herself directly in their line of approach. Her shoulder was still wrapped from the earlier shift, her muscles tired from 14 hours of trauma codes and emergency procedures, but her stance was absolute. Not aggressive. Just immovable. Like a tree that had weathered 1,000 storms and wasn't falling to 2 more. He's not leaving. The lead intruder's jaw tightened. His hand moved toward his waist, not for the gun, something smaller. Something that caught the fluorescent light with a dull metallic gleam. A combat knife, serrated edge, the kind designed for work in close quarters. Move. This is your last warning. The knife came up in a controlled arc, textbook stabbing technique, the kind Megan recognized from her own hand-to-hand training sessions in Kuwait, 2009. She raised her left arm to deflect, her palm connecting with his wrist, redirecting the blade's trajectory. The knife slid past her shoulder, but not past, it caught her, the serrated edge biting through scrub fabric and skin and muscle like a saw through meat. Hot. Sharp. Real. Pain bloomed across her upper back, spreading like spilled coffee. Her vision flickered but held. She didn't cry out. Didn't stumble. Didn't move from in front of Captain O'Brien's bed. The second intruder was already moving, another blade, longer, more purposeful. He came from the other angle, trying to go around her, trying to reach the patient through the gap on her right. Megan twisted, using her torso as a shield, and the second knife found her side instead. The impact was different this time, deeper, moving through muscle and catching against something solid beneath. A rib, maybe. Her right side erupted in electric agony, the kind that made her vision tunnel at the edges, made her knees want to buckle. She didn't let them buckle. Her hand, the one attached to the arm that was now bleeding from a shoulder wound, shot out and found the blue code button on the wall mounted above the bed. Her finger came down hard, pressing it with trembling force, not from fear, but from the simple biological reality of massive acute trauma. Her body was going into shock. Her nervous system was flooding with catecholamines. Trembling was physics, not panic. The alarm shrieked through the ICU like something alive, an electronic scream that cut through every other sound in the hospital. Red lights began flashing. Overhead, the intercom crackled, Code Blue, ICU Bay 4. Code Blue, ICU Bay 4. The intruders hesitated, that moment of calculation, weighing escape against commitment. Megan fell forward across Captain O'Brien's bed, her body still positioned between him and the blades, her blood now painting the white sheets in arterial patterns. The knife wounds on her shoulder and side were pumping, real blood with real oxygen carrying capacity, her circulating volume dropping by the second. Pain was information, and the information was screaming. Security arrived 47 seconds after the code alarm. For officers, radios crackling, moving with the practiced urgency of men trained for exactly this scenario. The intruders bolted toward the emergency stairwell, one shouting something in a language Megan couldn't process through the fog that was creeping in at the edges of her vision. They were gone in seconds, boots thundering down concrete stairs, out into the Portland night. Captain O'Brien's hand grabbed her arm, the one without the shoulder wound. His grip was weak from blood loss and trauma, but his eyes were locked on hers, and he was mouthing something. She couldn't hear it over the alarm, over the security radio traffic, over the sound of her own blood dripping onto the floor with metronomic precision. Drip. 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 The monitors were beeping steadily. His monitors, not hers, she wasn't hooked up to anything. No pulse ox, no EKG, no central line measuring her own declining pressures. In a few minutes she would be. In a few minutes they would move her to Trauma Bay 1 and she would become a patient instead of a nurse, become the wounded instead of the healer, and everything she'd built in these 5 years of anonymity would unravel like thread pulled from a seam. Dr. Sterling appeared above her, his face unreadable. His mouth moved, forming words directed at the security team, get her stabilized. I'm calling administration. Then he was gone, moving through the ICU doors with the purposeful stride of a man who'd already decided how this story would end. Megan watched him go through vision that was already starting to blur at the edges, blood still seeping through the bandages that hadn't even been there long enough to stop bleeding from the first wound. 2 knives. 2 punctures. 2 massive problems she couldn't solve by staying still and saying nothing. The trauma team found her 10 minutes later, already pale from blood loss, already shivering despite the October heat. They got 2 large bore 4s in before her blood pressure bottomed out, 18-gauge lines in both antecubital spaces, one running normal saline, the other running a second unit of O-negative pulled from the blood bank. Someone was calling for an ultrasound. Someone else was cutting away her scrubs, assessing the wounds, making calculations about fascial planes and organ damage. "How deep?" a surgical resident asked, her hands probing the shoulder wound. "Deep," the attending said flatly. "Scalpel sharp entry. We're going to need CT before we close anything. Could be hitting rotator cuff, could be just tissue. The side wound is worse, that one's got trajectory. Could have nicked the spleen." Megan closed her eyes and let them work. That's when Dr. Sterling walked into the trauma bay administrator's office 3 floors above, already formulating his narrative. She could see it happening in her mind with perfect clarity, the spin, the angle, the reframing of what she'd done as reckless instead of heroic. He would say she'd provoked the intruders. He would say her erratic behavior, her undisclosed military trauma, her incomplete employment history, had created a situation that endangered the entire ICU floor. He would make a dozen phone calls before dawn. And by sunrise, she would be suspended. By noon, she would be terminated. The rain started around 2 a.m., falling in sheets against the Portland cemetery. Megan stood at her husband's grave in borrowed scrubs, hers were evidence now, with bandages wrapped tight around her shoulder and side, pain medication in her system making everything feel distant and disconnected like watching a movie of someone else's life. Tom O'Brien. 1978 to 2011, beloved husband and soldier. The granite was cool against her palm. She pressed her hand against it and felt nothing except the smooth weight of stone, the finality of it. 5 years she'd been hiding in this city while her son walked through life not knowing his mother had resurfaced in the same town. 5 years of teaching nurses how to do procedures that saved lives, helping trauma patients survive, keeping her head down and her past buried so deep it would never surface. Tonight she'd brought it screaming to the surface. "I failed him, Tom." Her voice cracked over the rain. "I failed to keep my head down. Failed to stay hidden. Failed to protect our son's commanding officer without destroying everything I built." She'd chosen anonymity after Baghdad because the PTSD had been unbearable, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way a drop tray sounded like incoming fire. She'd walked away from the Navy because she couldn't function at that level anymore, because she'd watched her husband's casket come home in a flag-draped metal container, because the idea of putting on that uniform again made her want to drive her car into the Willamette River. So she disappeared instead. Moved to Portland using her maiden name, O'Brien was too common, gotten her nursing license transferred, worked nights so she could avoid the daytime scrutiny of people who might ask questions. She'd become invisible, which was the only way she could keep breathing. Until tonight. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." The rain mixed with blood and tears as she kneeled in the mud in front of his grave, truly broken for the first time since burying him. The bandages were already bleeding through, she could feel the warmth spreading again, her body still trying to heal itself, still trying to survive, still trying to do what it had been trained to do. But she was tired of surviving. Then her phone rang at exactly 3:13 a.m. The number on the screen wasn't one she recognized, but the 703 area code was unmistakable, Virginia. Military bureaucracy code. Someone was calling from Arlington. From the Pentagon. She stared at the ringing phone for 3 full seconds, standing in the rain in a cemetery in Portland, bleeding through bandages, wondering if maybe the universe had other plans for her invisibility. She answered. Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, the kind of voice that belonged to someone with stars on their collar. "We need to talk about what happened tonight. We've been looking for you for a very long time." Dr. Sterling's face went white the moment the FBI agent walked through Oak Creek Memorial's administrative conference room doors. Not the color of shock, the color of a man watching his entire constructed reality collapse in real time. The agent placed a manila folder on the mahogany table with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested nothing inside was accidental. Megan stood in the doorway, bandaged shoulder and side hidden beneath fresh scrubs, watching Sterling's hands begin to tremble for the first time since she'd met him. The trembling wasn't restraint. It was panic. Dr. Michael Sterling, the agent said, voice flat as a warrant. Federal investigation into the armed intrusion at this facility has uncovered evidence of falsified personnel records, obstruction of justice, and fabrication of medical credentials. The words hung in the sterile air like a diagnosis. Sterling's lawyer, summoned 3 hours prior when the first subpoenas arrived, placed a hand on his arm, but Sterling was already moving, already reaching for words that wouldn't come. The agent continued without pause. You attempted to forge Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien's employment documentation to justify her termination, correct? I did no such thing. Those records were incomplete when she arrived. Sterling's voice cracked on the second sentence. Megan heard the shift, the same tone he'd used when the pericardiocentesis worked despite his opposition, when he realized she possessed skills he'd severely underestimated. The difference now was that he couldn't bully his way out of federal jurisdiction. The agent opened the folder. Inside were Sterling's own handwritten notes on hospital letterhead, specific instructions to the records department to alter Megan's military service documentation, electronic timestamps showing he'd accessed her personnel file 17 times in the past 48 hours, and photographs of altered documents bearing his digital signature. You didn't just falsify her records, the agent said. You falsified credentials for 3 other staff members, manipulated patient outcome data in quarterly board submissions, and coached witness statements about the armed intruders to hide the fact that Captain O'Brien was a planned assassination target, not a random attack. Sterling's lawyer grabbed his shoulder harder. Don't speak. But Sterling was already moving, already panicking, already making the mistake that guilty men make when confronted with precision. Those alterations were administrative corrections, standard hospital procedure. The data was incomplete. His voice rose with each excuse, each statement less credible than the last. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects feeding on his desperation. Megan watched his transformation from predator to prey with the same clinical detachment she'd shown during every humiliation, every thrown tray, every public mockery. No satisfaction. No anger. Just observation. We have 17 instances of obstruction, the agent continued, sliding documents across the table like playing cards. You contacted 3 board members at their home residences within 2 hours of the incident, specifically to file complaint about Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien before she'd even been treated for her injuries. You told Board Chair Patricia Hendricks that her undisclosed military trauma made her a liability. You attempted to have her terminated within 48 hours of a physical attack on hospital property that she prevented from becoming a homicide. The room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning unit cycling beneath the walls. Sterling's hands were moving now, grasping, reaching for the table edge like a drowning man reaching for a rope. I was protecting the hospital. I was protecting the board from liability. That woman had military PTSD, she was unstable, she provoked those men. She saved your patient's life. The agent's voice never changed pitch. And when she did, you moved to destroy her rather than thank her. That's not hospital protection, Dr. Sterling. That's criminal behavior. The administrator entered then, Director Chen, a woman Megan had spoken to exactly 3 times in her 2 weeks at Oak Creek Memorial. She carried Sterling's hospital credentials on a lanyard, his access badge, his security card, his physician identification. She placed them on the table beside the folder of evidence. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated, Chen said. Your medical license will be reported to the Oregon Medical Board with a full account of these findings. You're to vacate the premises within 30 minutes, and you are not to contact any hospital staff or patients. Sterling tried to stand. The federal agent placed a hand on his shoulder and he sat back down. The leather chair squeaked beneath his weight. You can't do this. I have associations, I have relationships with attorneys, with hospital board members, with people who aren't answering your calls anymore, the agent said. Megan heard that truth land harder than any physical blow. She understood then what happened to men like Sterling when their institutional power suddenly evaporated. Their network wasn't loyalty. It was transactional. The moment he became liability instead of asset, every connection severed simultaneously. Board members were already distancing themselves. Attorneys were already declining representation. The chief of surgery, who'd sat beside Sterling at hospital functions for 8 years, would pretend not to know his name within 48 hours. The agent stood. So did the administrator. So did Sterling's lawyer, stepping away from his client like contagion. Sterling remained seated, hands on the mahogany table, staring at his own credentials like they belonged to a stranger. "I want to know who reported me," he whispered. "I want to know who betrayed me." "Captain James O'Brien's command," the FBI agent said. The moment he recovered consciousness and learned that someone had tried to have his defender terminated, the 75th Ranger Regiment contacted NCIS. From there, it went directly to the Bureau. "You didn't get betrayed by someone in this hospital, Dr. Sterling. You got investigated by people who take care of their own. You just didn't realize who that was." The agent placed handcuffs on the mahogany table. Silver metal. Stainless steel. The kind of equipment that looked obscene against the polished wood. Sterling stared at them like they were going to animate themselves. Megan felt no triumph watching this. She'd been trained to understand that victory and defeat were simply positions on a timeline. Sterling was experiencing both simultaneously. His defeat didn't require her presence anymore. It was self-sustaining. A man with no network, no credentials, no institutional protection, sitting alone in a conference room while federal agents waited for him to accept the inevitable. "You can walk out voluntarily," the agent said, "or we can make this a formal arrest on federal charges of obstruction of justice and falsifying official documents. Obstruction carries up to 20 years. Falsifying federal documents carries up to 5 per count, and we have 73 counts." Sterling's face crumbled. Not rage. Not dignity. Just the broken expression of a man watching his life compress into a single moment of consequence. He stood slowly, held out his wrists, and the handcuffs clicked around them with the sound of a lock mechanism, soft, metallic, final. Megan watched him shuffle toward the door, where 2 additional federal agents waited, uniformed and silent. Behind them, the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial had begun to fill with people. She could hear boots on tile now. 1, 2, 3, 4. Dozens of boots on tile. The 200 Special Forces operators had been waiting in the lobby since dawn. They parted like water as Sterling was escorted through the corridors, their dress uniforms immaculate, their presence transforming the hospital into something between a military installation and a cathedral. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved toward him. The silence was more powerful than any words they could have chosen. Sterling was led past the nurses' station, past the trauma bays, past the ICU where Captain O'Brien lay recovering with his name already legendary throughout the regiment. Past Megan herself, who stood with her hands at her sides, meeting his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. She didn't gloat. She didn't speak. She witnessed. That was enough. The media cameras were already positioned outside Oak Creek Memorial's main entrance when Sterling emerged into Portland's morning light. News vans from 3 local stations. Photographers with professional-grade equipment. Someone in the Special Forces network had alerted the press, had ensured that Sterling's perp walk would be documented, digitized, and shared across social media within hours. His face would become synonymous with institutional corruption. His name would appear in searches alongside falsified records and medical fraud for decades. He moved toward the federal transport vehicle with handcuffs catching the light, and Megan felt the weight of her shoulder wound settle into her awareness, not pain, but information, data about what she'd survived to get here. Captain O'Brien's deposition revealed that the 2 armed intruders had been contract operatives tasked with preventing his testimony regarding military procurement fraud, a scheme that had compromised medical supply chains supporting forward operating bases across Afghanistan and Iraq. Sterling had accepted payment to facilitate the patient transfer, had been paid approximately $200,000 to provide access credentials and patient location information. The money had been traced to accounts connected to defense contractors operating outside federal oversight. The operation had been designed to eliminate O'Brien as a witness. Instead, it had created a situation where the Special Forces community discovered not only an attempt on one of their own, but also discovered Megan O'Brien in the process. Sterling's career entered formal review. His medical license was suspended immediately. The Oregon Medical Board opened an investigation into 15 years of his practice, finding a pattern of intimidation, falsified credentials, manipulation of patient outcomes, and abuse of institutional authority that had gone unchecked because of his network with hospital board members, insurance company executives, and regional medical administrators. Each person distanced themselves within hours of his arrest. Board Chair Patricia Hendricks issued a statement regretting that the hospital hadn't detected Sterling's conduct sooner. The chief of surgery, who'd socialized with Sterling for 8 years, declined comment. The network he'd weaponized became the network that ensured his complete professional isolation. Within 48 hours, Dr. Michael Sterling's name had disappeared from Oak Creek Memorial's roster, his office reassigned, his presence erased. He retained criminal attorneys, faced federal trial, and ultimately accepted a plea deal that included 6 years of federal prison, 5 years of supervised release, and permanent revocation of his medical license. The news cycle moved on within a week. Sterling became a footnote in Portland medical history, a cautionary tale about what happens when institutional power meets complete professional isolation. But that night, as Megan stood at the edge of the parking lot where her car was parked, where rain had begun to fall and the temperature had dropped, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Not the Pentagon this time. From Captain O'Brien himself, Senior Chief, the team wants to know if you'll join us for a debrief tomorrow morning. They've already reserved a table at the diner on 3rd. Be prepared for gratitude that doesn't have off switches. Sir, yes sir. She stared at those words for 30 seconds, the rain cold against her bandaged shoulder, understanding that her life had just shifted into a new configuration. The anonymity she'd chosen was over. The invisible healer was now visible. The woman who'd chosen to disappear was now surrounded by people who understood exactly who she was and wanted to keep her there. She typed back, "What time?" The response came immediately, 0700 hours. And Senior Chief? Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for reminding me what honor looks like. Megan watched the rain hammer the parking lot, watched it collect in puddles that reflected the hospital's neon signs, and felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt since Baghdad. Not peace. Not happiness. But purpose. Recognition. The knowledge that she'd been seen, finally, by people who understood the cost of what she carried. The combat boots were waiting at home in her closet. Tom's memory was honored. Sterling's cruelty had been documented and punished through systems far larger than any individual institution. And tomorrow morning, at a diner on 3rd Street, 200 Special Forces operators were waiting to say thank you to someone they'd been searching for since she disappeared into anonymity 8 years ago. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in power who didn't know your true value, I want to hear your story in the comments. Share your moment of recognition, your vindication, your proof that quiet strength outlasts institutional cruelty every single time. Like and subscribe so you never miss a story about people who survive by refusing to be broken. And if you know a nurse, a teacher, a parent, or a quiet person doing extraordinary work in the background, take a moment to tell them they've been seen. Tell them their strength matters. Tell them their dignity is not negotiable.